The piercing wail of sirens split the morning air as Karen Whitmore stood unmoved. Her arms crossed defiantly in front of the van's wheelchair ramp. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against her designer blazer, while her cold blue eyes fixed on the medical transport vehicle with undisguised contempt. The ambulance lights painted the pristine suburban street in alternating red and blue, casting harsh shadows across the manicured lawns of Meadowbrook Estates. "Ma'am, please step aside," called out Miguel Santos, the van driver, his voice strained with barely contained frustration. Behind him, through the van's tinted windows, 15-year-old Jacob Chen pressed his face against the glass, his wheelchair secured in place, watching the confrontation unfold with growing anxiety. Today was supposed to be routine. His bi-weekly spinal therapy appointment at the rehabilitation center. Instead, it had become a nightmare. Karen's lips curled into a thin smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. She had been the self-appointed guardian of Meadowbrook Estates for 3 years now, ever since her husband's promotion to regional sales director had afforded them the sprawling colonial on Elm Street. Every morning, she patrolled the neighborhood in her white golf cart, clipboard in hand, searching for violations of the homeowners association rules she had personally crafted and zealously enforced. "This vehicle is too large for our residential streets," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Section 4.2 of our HOA regulations clearly states that commercial vehicles are prohibited from extended parking in residential areas. Furthermore, this monstrosity lowers our neighborhood's aesthetic appeal and property values. Miguel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. In his 15 years of driving medical transport, he had encountered difficult people before, but nothing quite like this. The van was barely larger than a standard SUV, specially equipped with wheelchair accessibility features that were invisible to the casual observer. But explaining this to Karen Whitmore felt like trying to reason with a brick wall. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but this is a medical transport vehicle. We're here to pick up Jacob Chen for his scheduled therapy appointment. He has a spinal condition that requires specialized treatment. And we're already running late." Inside the van, Jacob's mother, Dr. Linda Chen, a renowned pediatric neurologist at Children's Hospital, sat beside her son with worry etched across her features. She had witnessed Karen's antics before the woman had once spent 20 minutes berating a delivery driver for parking too close to her driveway. But this was different. This was targeted. This was personal. Karen's expression hardened. "I don't care what kind of vehicle it is. Rules are rules. I've already called the police and our HOA security team. This neighborhood has standards, and I won't have them compromised by oversized vehicles cluttering our streets." As if summoned by her words, her pristine white golf cart appeared around the corner. Moving with mechanical precision toward the van, she had positioned it strategically, blocking the van's only exit route while maintaining her position in front of the ramp. The morning sun glinted off the cart's chrome accents, and its electric motor hummed with quiet menace. "Doctor." Chen stepped out of the van, her professional composure intact, despite the fury burning in her chest. She was a woman who had spent her career fighting for disabled children, advocating for their rights in hospital boardrooms and insurance company offices. She would not be intimidated by a suburban tyrant with a clipboard and a sense of entitlement. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, her voice steady and measured. "My son has a medical appointment that cannot be delayed. His spinal condition requires consistent therapy to prevent deterioration. Every minute we waste here is a minute stolen from his treatment." Karen's eyes narrowed as she recognized the doctor. They had clashed before at neighborhood meetings, where Dr. Chen had consistently opposed Karen's increasingly restrictive HOA proposals. The woman's calm professionalism had always grated against Karen's nerves, a reminder of the education and respect that Karen felt she deserved, but never quite achieved. "Your son's condition doesn't give you special privileges," Karen replied, her voice dripping with disdain. "If you wanted to live in a neighborhood with appropriate medical facilities, perhaps you should have chosen a different area. This is a residential community, not a medical district." The cruelty of the words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Miguel's face flushed with anger, while Dr. Chen's composure began to crack. Inside the van, Jacob's hands trembled as he processed the conversation, his therapy appointment slipping further away with each passing moment. Across the street, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had lived in Meadowbrook for decades, watched from her porch with growing concern. She remembered when the neighborhood had been welcoming, when neighbors helped each other instead of harassing them. Karen's reign as HOA president had changed everything. "You're making a big mistake, Doctor," Chen said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that Karen was too blinded by her own righteousness to hear. "This is discrimination against a disabled minor, and it won't be tolerated." Karen laughed, a harsh sound that grated against the morning air. "Discrimination, I'm enforcing community standards. If you don't like it, you can always move somewhere more accommodating to your family's needs." The police arrived 10 minutes later, their squad car rolling slowly down the street as Officer Martinez surveyed the scene with professional detachment. He had responded to calls in Meadowbrook Estates before, usually involving Karen Whitmore and her various crusades against imagined neighborhood infractions. This time felt different. Though, this time, there was a medical transport van involved, and a disabled teenager visible through the windows. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Martinez asked, stepping out of his patrol car with the weariness of someone who had dealt with similar situations too many times before. Karen immediately launched into her prepared speech about HOA regulations and community standards, waving her clipboard like a weapon while gesturing dramatically at the van. Her voice rose with each accusation, painting herself as the victim of a conspiracy to undermine neighborhood property values. Officer Martinez listened patiently, occasionally glancing at the van where Jacob sat waiting, his wheelchair clearly visible through the specialized windows. When Karen finished her tirade, he turned to Dr. Chen with the expression of professional sympathy. "Doctor, can you explain the situation from your perspective?" Dr. Chen's explanation was concise and factual. She outlined Jacob's medical condition, the necessity of his therapy appointments, and the completely legal nature of the medical transport service. She spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with bureaucratic obstacles in the healthcare system. "Officer, I understand Ms. Whitmore's concerns about community standards, but this is a medical necessity. My son's spinal condition requires consistent therapy to prevent permanent damage. This transport service is licensed and insured, and we're not violating any city ordinances." Karen's face flushed with anger as she realized the officer was not immediately taking her side. "I don't care what kind of medical condition he has. Rules are rules. And I won't have this neighborhood turned into a medical parking lot because one family thinks they're special." The officer's expression hardened. In his 8 years on the force, he had learned to recognize the difference between legitimate community concerns and petty tyranny. This situation clearly fell into the latter category. "Ma'am, I need you to move your golf cart and allow this vehicle to proceed. Medical transport services are exempt from most parking restrictions, and you're interfering with a minor's access to necessary medical care." Karen's eyes blazed with fury. "I am the president of this homeowners association, and I will not be dictated to by someone who doesn't understand the importance of community standards. I'm calling my lawyer." She pulled out her phone with theatrical flourish, speed dialing a number she had memorized through frequent use. Her lawyer, a man named Davidson, who specialized in HOA disputes, answered on the second ring. Davidson, this is Karen Whitmore. I need you to contact the police department immediately. They're attempting to override my authority as HOA president, and I won't stand for it. The conversation continued for several minutes, Karen's voice rising and falling as she painted herself as the victim of a conspiracy involving the police, the medical transport company, and the Chen family. She gesticulated wildly, her perfectly styled blonde hair coming loose from its clips as her composure cracked. Meanwhile, Jacob's condition began to deteriorate inside the van. The stress of the confrontation, combined with the delay in his therapy appointment, was causing muscle spasms in his back. Dr. Chen noticed his distress immediately, her maternal instincts overriding her professional restraint. Jacob needs to get to his appointment now, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of a doctor dealing with a medical emergency. These delays are causing him physical distress, and I won't tolerate it any longer. Officer Martinez nodded grimly. Ma'am, I'm ordering you to move your golf cart immediately. You're interfering with emergency medical transport, and I can arrest you for obstruction if necessary. Karen's lawyer apparently advised her to comply, because she reluctantly ended the call and stalked toward her golf cart. But her compliance came with a stream of invective directed at the Chen family that would have made a sailor blush. This isn't over, she snarled as she moved the cart. I'm filing complaints with the city council, the state health department, and anyone else who will listen. This family has been nothing but trouble since they moved here, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. The van finally pulled away from the curb, carrying Jacob toward his desperately needed therapy appointment. But the damage had been done. Word of the confrontation spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, dividing residents into camps and setting the stage for an even larger conflict. That evening, Karen Whitmore sat in her home office, surrounded by stacks of HOA documents and legal precedents. Her husband, Richard, a mild-mannered man who had learned to avoid his wife's crusades, peered around the door with obvious reluctance. Karen, honey, maybe you should let this one go. The Chen family seems like nice people, and their son clearly needs medical care. Karen's response was swift and decisive. Richard, you don't understand the bigger picture. If we allow one family to flout our rules, soon everyone will think they can do whatever they want. Property values will plummet, and our investment will be worthless. She had already drafted a lengthy email to the HOA board, outlining her version of the day's events and requesting an emergency meeting to address what she termed the medical transport crisis. The email painted the Chen family as entitled troublemakers who believed their personal circumstances exempted them from community standards. At the same time, across town, Dr. Chen was making phone calls of her own. As a respected physician with connections throughout the medical community, she had resources that Karen could never have imagined. Her first call was to the State Disability Rights Organization, where she detailed the morning's events and Karen's discriminatory behavior. But it was her second call that would prove most significant. She dialed a number she rarely used, except for family emergencies or holidays. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Linda, is everything okay? You don't usually call this late. Dr. Chen's brother, David, was a man accustomed to crisis calls. As the governor's chief of staff, he dealt with emergencies on a daily basis, budget crises, political scandals, natural disasters. But a call from his sister was different. It was personal. David, I'm sorry to bother you, but something happened today that I need to discuss with someone. It involves Jacob. The concern in David's voice was immediate and palpable. Jacob was his only nephew, a bright kid whose spinal condition had been a source of family worry for years. David had personally ensured that Jacob had access to the best medical care available, using his connections to arrange consultations with specialists across the country. What happened? Is he okay? Doctor. Chen recounted the morning's events in detail, describing Karen's behavior, the delay in Jacob's therapy, and the discriminatory language that had been used. She spoke with clinical precision, but David could hear the anger and hurt beneath her professional composure. She actually said he should live somewhere else because of his disability. David's voice carried the controlled fury of someone accustomed to dealing with political crises, but unaccustomed to personal attacks on his family. Her exact words were that, if we wanted to live in a neighborhood with appropriate medical facilities, we should have chosen a different area. She called our street a residential community, not a medical district. David was quiet for a long moment, his political mind already analyzing the situation from multiple angles. As the governor's chief of staff, he had dealt with discrimination cases before, usually from the perspective of policy implementation and public relations. This time, it was personal. Linda, I need you to document everything that happened today. Get witness statements from the neighbors who saw the confrontation. Contact the police officer who responded and request a copy of his report. And send me the names of everyone involved, including this HOA president. David, I don't want to make this into a big political thing. I just want Jacob to be able to get to his therapy appointments without harassment. Sister, this is already a big thing. What happened to Jacob is illegal under both state and federal disability rights laws. This woman targeted a disabled minor and interfered with his access to medical care. That's not just wrong, it's criminal. As they talked, David began to understand the broader implications of the situation. Disability rights had been one of the governor's key policy initiatives, and discrimination cases were taken seriously by the state attorney general's office. If this Karen Whitmore had truly behaved as Linda described, she was about to face consequences far beyond anything her HOA authority could protect her from. I'm going to make some calls, David said finally. This kind of behavior can't be tolerated, especially when it involves a minor with a disability. But I want to handle this carefully. We need to follow proper procedures and let the system work. After ending the call, David sat in his office for several minutes, staring out at the city lights while his mind raced through the possibilities. He had the power to make Karen Whitmore's life very difficult, but he also had the responsibility to ensure that justice was served through appropriate channels. His first call was to the State Attorney General's Civil Rights Division, as the governor's chief of staff. His calls were always returned promptly, and this one was no exception. Within minutes, he was speaking with Sarah Morrison, the state's leading prosecutor for disability rights cases. Sarah, I need to report a potential ADA violation involving a disabled minor. The incident occurred this morning in Meadowbrook Estates, and I have reason to believe it was part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior by a local HOA president. Morrison listened carefully as David outlined the facts, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific details. Her expertise in disability law made her immediately recognize the serious nature of the violations, and her prosecutorial instincts were already engaged. David, this sounds like a clear case of discrimination and interference with access to medical care. If the facts are as you've described, we're looking at both state and federal violations. I'll need to interview the victims and gather evidence, but this could result in both criminal charges and civil penalties. I want to make sure this is handled properly. My nephew is the victim here, but I don't want anyone to think we're using political influence to get special treatment. This needs to be about justice, not politics. Morrison's respect for David's position was evident in her response. I understand your concerns, but you need to understand something too. What happened to your nephew is exactly the kind of case our office was created to handle. We're not doing him any favors by prosecuting. We're doing our job." The next morning brought no peace to Meadowbrook Estates. Karen Whitmore arrived at the HOA office building early, her arms full of documentation and her mind focused on the emergency board meeting she had scheduled for that afternoon. She had spent the entire night preparing her case, outlining the threat that the Chen family posed to neighborhood stability and property values. The HOA board consisted of 5 members, including Karen as president. The other 4 members were Bob Patterson, a retired engineer; Martha Stewart, no relation to the celebrity; a real estate agent, James Wu, a software developer; and Patricia Gonzalez, a high school principal. They were generally good people who had volunteered for the board to help maintain their neighborhood. But they had gradually been dominated by Karen's strong personality and endless energy. Karen had carefully crafted her presentation to focus on rule enforcement and property values, while minimizing the medical aspects of Jacob's situation. She presented charts showing declining property values in neighborhoods with excessive commercial vehicle traffic, and quoted selectively from HOA legal precedents that seemed to support her position. "The Chen family has been testing our authority for months," she explained to the assembled board members. "First, they challenged our landscaping requirements. Then they objected to our noise ordinances. Now they're bringing commercial vehicles into our neighborhood on a regular basis, claiming medical necessity as justification." James Wu, who lived 3 houses down from the Chens, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had witnessed the previous day's confrontation from his home office window, and Karen's description didn't match what he had seen. The commercial vehicle had been a standard medical transport van, and the regular basis was actually twice weekly therapy appointments. "Karen, I was working from home yesterday and saw what happened. That wasn't a commercial vehicle in any meaningful sense. It was clearly a medical transport van. And Dr. Chen's son is disabled. Shouldn't we be making accommodations for residents with medical needs?" Karen's response was swift and dismissive. "James, I appreciate your concern for our neighbors, but we can't make exceptions to our rules based on personal circumstances. If we allow medical vehicles today, what's to stop residents from claiming other special needs tomorrow? We need to maintain consistent standards." Patricia Gonzalez, who worked with disabled students every day as a high school principal, found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. She had been quiet during most of Karen's presentation, but the dismissive attitude toward a disabled child's medical needs struck her as both legally problematic and morally wrong. "Karen, I have to ask, are you familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act? Because what you're describing sounds like it could be a violation of federal disability rights laws. Schools and public accommodations have to make reasonable accommodations for disabled individuals, and I suspect HOAs fall under similar requirements." Karen's face flushed with irritation. "Patricia, we're not running a school or a public accommodation. We're a private homeowners association with the right to establish and enforce community standards. The ADA doesn't apply to our situation." This statement was not only legally incorrect, but also demonstrated Karen's fundamental misunderstanding of disability rights law. The ADA's coverage extended far beyond schools and public accommodations, and housing discrimination based on disability was specifically prohibited under both federal and state law. Martha Stewart, the real estate agent, had been quietly reviewing the legal documents Karen had distributed. Her professional experience with housing law made her increasingly nervous about the liability implications of Karen's proposed actions. "Karen, I need to raise some concerns about the legal exposure we're creating here. If we take official action to prevent a disabled resident from accessing medical care, we could be opening the HOA to significant lawsuits. Fair housing laws are very strict about disability discrimination. Karen's response revealed the depth of her commitment to her position. "Martha, I've consulted with our lawyer, and he assures me that we're on solid legal ground. We're not discriminating against anyone, we're enforcing uniformly applied community standards. The Chen family knew our rules when they moved here." Bob Patterson, the retired engineer, had been studying the technical specifications Karen had provided about vehicle sizes and street capacity. His engineering background made him approach problems methodically, and he was finding significant flaws in Karen's analysis. "Karen, I've been looking at these vehicle dimension charts you provided, and I have to point out that the medical transport van is actually smaller than several residents' pickup trucks and SUVs. If size is really the issue, we'd need to restrict those vehicles as well. But more importantly, the van is only in the neighborhood for about 10 minutes twice a week. That hardly constitutes a traffic problem." The meeting continued for another hour, with Karen becoming increasingly frustrated as her fellow board members raised logical and legal objections to her proposed actions. By the end, it was clear that she lacked the support needed to take official HOA action against the Chen family. But Karen Whitmore was not a woman who accepted defeat gracefully. If the board wouldn't support her, she would take matters into her own hands. She began planning a more aggressive campaign against the Chen family, one that would force them to comply with her vision of community standards. That afternoon, she drafted a letter to every resident in Meadowbrook Estates, detailing what she called the medical transport crisis, and urging neighbors to contact the Chen family directly to express their concerns. The letter was filled with inflammatory language designed to turn neighborhood sentiment against the family. She also contacted the local newspaper, offering to provide an exclusive interview about the challenge of maintaining community standards in the face of special interest demands. Karen saw herself as a crusader for suburban values, and she was prepared to take her fight to the media if necessary. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Karen, state investigators were already gathering evidence about her behavior. Sarah Morrison had dispatched a team of civil rights attorneys to interview witnesses and document the discrimination case. They spoke with neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation, reviewed police reports, and collected evidence of Karen's pattern of harassment. Dr. Chen, following her brother's advice, had meticulously documented every interaction with Karen Whitmore over the past several months. The pattern that emerged was disturbing: a systematic campaign of harassment directed at a family with a disabled child, escalating from minor complaints to direct interference with medical care. The investigation revealed that Karen's behavior extended beyond the Chen family. She had previously harassed an elderly veteran who used a mobility scooter, claiming it was an unauthorized vehicle on neighborhood sidewalks. She had also targeted a single mother who received food deliveries from a meal service, arguing that the delivery van violated commercial vehicle restrictions. The pattern was clear. Karen Whitmore used HOA regulations as a weapon against residents she viewed as different or challenging to her authority. Her actions constituted a systematic pattern of discrimination that went far beyond overzealous rule enforcement. The breaking point came 3 days later. Jacob Chen had another therapy appointment, and Dr. Chen had specifically requested that the transport service arrive early to avoid any potential confrontation with Karen Whitmore. The van pulled up to their house at 8:30 a.m., 30 minutes before Jacob's usual pickup time. But Karen had been watching. She had stationed herself in her front yard since 8:00 a.m., gardening shears in hand, pretending to trim her already perfect hedges while keeping a careful eye on the Chen house. The moment the van appeared, she dropped her tools and marched toward the street with grim determination. This time, she came prepared. She had printed copies of HOA regulations, photographs of the van from multiple angles, and a petition signed by what she claimed were concerned neighbors demanding action against the Chen family. Her golf cart was already positioned strategically to block the van's exit route. "I thought I made myself clear," she announced as Miguel stepped out of the van. "This vehicle is not welcome in our neighborhood. I have documentation proving that you're in violation of multiple HOA regulations, and I'm prepared to have you arrested for trespassing." Miguel's patience, already stretched thin from previous encounters with Karen, finally snapped. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't own this street. This is a legal medical transport service, and you have no authority to prevent us from doing our job." Karen's response was swift and vicious. "I have every authority to protect this neighborhood from people who think they're above the rules. Your so-called patient is nothing but a burden on our community, and his family should have the decency to move somewhere more appropriate for their needs." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Miguel's face flushed with anger. While inside the van, both Jacob and Dr. Chen heard every word. The naked cruelty of the statement targeting a disabled teenager as a burden crossed every line of human decency and legal protection. Dr. Chen emerged from the van with barely controlled fury. "Ms. Whitmore, you've just made a very serious mistake. What you just said constitutes hate speech directed at a disabled minor, and I will make sure that every relevant authority knows about it." Karen's response revealed the depth of her delusion. "Hate speech. I'm speaking the truth. Your son is a burden on this community, and everyone knows it. The constant medical vehicles, the special accommodations, the way you people act like you're entitled to special treatment, it's ruining our neighborhood." Unbeknownst to Karen, her tirade was being recorded. James Wu, the HOA board member who lived nearby, had been monitoring the situation from his home office. When he saw Karen approach the van, he began recording the confrontation on his phone, capturing every word of her discriminatory statements. Several neighbors had also been drawn to the scene by the raised voices. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who had watched previous confrontations with growing concern, stood on her porch with obvious distress. She had lived through the civil rights era and recognized the ugly language of discrimination when she heard it. "Karen, stop this right now," Mrs. Rodriguez called out from her porch. "What you're doing is wrong, and you know it. That boy has every right to medical care, and you have no right to interfere." Karen's response was to double down on her position. "Maria, you don't understand the broader implications of what's happening here. If we allow one family to flout our rules, property values will collapse. Everyone's investment is at risk because of their selfish demands." The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Karen's behavior had crossed from harassment into what was clearly criminal territory, and the witnesses were documenting everything. Dr. Chen, drawing on her years of experience dealing with hospital bureaucracy and insurance company obstacles, recognized that this was the moment to make a stand. "Miguel, please proceed with Jacob's transport. Ms. Whitmore, you are interfering with a disabled minor's access to medical care, which is illegal under both state and federal law. I'm calling the police, and I'm also calling my attorney." Karen's response was to physically position herself in front of the van's ramp. "I'm not moving until you people understand that this neighborhood has standards. Your son's condition doesn't make him special, and it doesn't give you the right to ignore our rules." The police arrived within minutes, but this time they were accompanied by a detective from the State Attorney General's Civil Rights Division. The investigation into Karen's behavior had been ongoing for several days, and the authorities were now prepared to take definitive action. Detective Lisa Park stepped out of her unmarked car and surveyed the scene with professional detachment. She had been investigating discrimination cases for 5 years, and she immediately recognized the signs of a hate crime in progress. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the vehicle," she said to Karen, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. You're interfering with a medical transport service, and I have reason to believe you're violating state and federal disability rights laws." Karen's response revealed the depth of her entitlement. "Detective, I am the president of this homeowners association, and I'm enforcing our community standards. These people are trying to turn our neighborhood into a medical facility, and I won't stand for it." Detective Park had dealt with Karen's type before individuals who believed their local authority exempted them from federal law. Her response was swift and definitive. "Ma'am, your position as HOA president doesn't give you the right to discriminate against disabled individuals or interfere with their access to medical care. I'm placing you under arrest for violation of civil rights laws, interference with medical services, and harassment of a disabled minor." The words hit Karen like a physical blow. In all her years of HOA enforcement, she had never imagined that her actions could result in criminal charges. Her face went pale as the detective began reading her rights, the familiar words taking on new meaning when directed at her personally. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The handcuffs clicked shut around Karen's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo through the neighborhood. Her perfectly manicured nails scraped against the metal as she was led toward the patrol car, her face flushed with humiliation and disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she protested as she was placed in the back seat. "I'm trying to protect this neighborhood, and you're treating me like a criminal. My lawyer will have me out of here in an hour." But Karen's lawyer was about to discover that this case was far more serious than his usual HOA disputes. The state attorney general's office had been building a comprehensive case against her, and the charges were both state and federal. Her arrest was just the beginning of what would become a very long legal battle. As the patrol car pulled away, the neighborhood fell into stunned silence. Mrs. Rodriguez stood on her porch with tears in her eyes, relieved that the harassment was finally over, but saddened by the ugly reality of what her community had become. James Wu immediately uploaded his recording to the state Civil Rights Division, ensuring that Karen's discriminatory statements would be preserved as evidence. Jacob's medical transport van finally proceeded to the rehabilitation center, 45 minutes late, but no longer obstructed. Inside the van, Jacob pressed his face against the window, watching the familiar neighborhood streets roll by. For the first time in months, he felt safe in his own community. The news of Karen Whitmore's arrest spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire. But it was the next morning's newspaper headline that turned the story into a statewide sensation: HOA president arrested for blocking disabled teens' medical van family, connected to governor's office. The article, written by investigative journalist Sarah Martinez, provided a detailed account of Karen's pattern of harassment and discrimination. It included quotes from neighbors who had witnessed her behavior, excerpts from HOA meeting minutes that revealed her discriminatory attitudes, and a comprehensive timeline of her escalating campaign against the Chen family. But the most damaging revelation was the connection between the Chen family and the governor's office. When the article revealed that Jacob's uncle was David Chen, the governor's chief of staff, the story took on political dimensions that Karen could never have imagined. The governor's office had been carefully monitoring the situation, but they had deliberately avoided any direct involvement to ensure that the case was handled through proper legal channels. However, once the criminal charges were filed and the case became public, the governor felt compelled to make a statement. The press conference was held at the state capitol, with Governor Patricia Williams standing behind the podium, flanked by the state attorney general and the director of the Disability Rights Commission. The governor's words were carefully chosen, but unmistakably strong. The state of our great state will not tolerate discrimination against disabled individuals, particularly when it involves children and their access to medical care. The incident in Meadowbrook Estates represents a clear violation of both state and federal disability rights laws. And we will prosecute it to the full extent of the law, the governor continued. I want to be clear that this investigation and prosecution would be proceeding regardless of any personal connections. No child should be denied access to medical care because of their disability, and no family should be harassed for seeking treatment for their child's medical condition. The press conference sent shockwaves through HOA communities across the state. The message was clear: local authority did not exempt anyone from federal civil rights laws, and discrimination against disabled individuals would be prosecuted with the full force of state and federal law enforcement. Karen Whitmore, meanwhile, was discovering that her legal troubles were far more serious than she had initially understood. Her attorney, who had previously handled routine HOA disputes, was now dealing with federal civil rights charges that carried potential prison sentences and substantial financial penalties. Karen, I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. Her lawyer explained during their first meeting after her arrest. You're facing federal hate crime charges, violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, interference with medical services, and civil rights violations. The state attorney general's office has a strong case, and the federal prosecutors are also considering charges. The reality of her situation began to sink in as Karen learned about the potential consequences of her actions. The federal charges alone could result in up to 10 years in prison and fines of up to $250,000. The civil rights violations carried additional penalties, and the Chen family was preparing a substantial civil lawsuit for damages and harassment. But the legal consequences were only part of Karen's punishment. The media attention surrounding the case had made her a national symbol of HOA overreach and disability discrimination. Her photograph appeared on news websites across the country, accompanied by articles detailing her harassment of a disabled teenager. The court of public opinion was harsh and unforgiving. Social media exploded with outrage over Karen's behavior, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of HOA harassment and disability discrimination. The hashtag #JusticeForJacob began trending nationally, turning the case into a symbol of the broader fight for disability rights. The backlash extended to Karen's personal and professional life. Her husband Richard, who had tried to distance himself from her HOA activities, found himself under scrutiny at work. The regional sales director position that had allowed them to afford their Meadowbrook Estates home was now in jeopardy as his company faced public relations pressure to distance itself from the discrimination scandal. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA, meanwhile, was in crisis. The other board members, led by Patricia Gonzalez, called an emergency meeting to address the situation and distance the organization from Karen's actions. They voted unanimously to remove her as president and to revise the HOA's policies to ensure compliance with disability rights laws. The actions of our former president do not represent the values of our community, Patricia announced at a packed neighborhood meeting. We are committed to making Meadowbrook Estates a welcoming place for all residents, regardless of disability or medical needs. The meeting also included a formal apology to the Chen family and a pledge to cover the costs of Jacob's missed therapy appointments. The new board implemented a comprehensive policy overhaul that explicitly protected residents' rights to medical care and transportation services. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Karen's actions was the broader policy changes that resulted from the case. The governor signed executive orders strengthening enforcement of disability rights laws and providing additional resources for investigating discrimination complaints. The state legislature began considering comprehensive HOA reform legislation that would prevent similar incidents in the future. The case also prompted federal authorities to review HOA regulations and enforcement practices across the country. The Department of Justice issued new guidance clarifying that HOA rules could not be used to circumvent federal disability rights protections. And they established a special unit to investigate discrimination complaints against homeowners associations. 6 months after her arrest, Karen Whitmore stood in federal court facing the consequences of her actions. The prosecution had built a comprehensive case documenting her pattern of harassment and discrimination, supported by witness testimony, recorded statements, and evidence of her systematic targeting of vulnerable residents. The courtroom was packed with supporters of the Chen family, disability rights advocates, and members of the media. Jacob Chen, now 16 and stronger, after months of uninterrupted therapy, sat in the front row with his parents and uncle, his presence a powerful reminder of the human cost of discrimination. Federal prosecutor Sarah Morrison presented the government's case with methodical precision, outlining each instance of Karen's discriminatory behavior and demonstrating how it violated federal civil rights laws. The evidence was overwhelming: recorded statements, witness accounts, and documentation of Karen's pattern of harassment painted a clear picture of systematic discrimination. The defendant's actions were not those of an overzealous volunteer trying to maintain community standards, Morrison argued. They were the deliberate actions of someone who targeted a disabled child and his family for harassment, interference, and discrimination. She used her position of authority to deny a disabled minor access to medical care, and she did so with full knowledge of the harm she was causing. Karen's defense attorney attempted to portray her as a well-meaning volunteer who had made mistakes in judgment, but the evidence of her pattern of discrimination was too strong to overcome. The recorded statements in which she called Jacob a burden and suggested that disabled families should live elsewhere were particularly damaging. When the judge asked Karen if she wanted to make a statement before sentencing, she stood slowly, her face pale and drawn. The woman who had once wielded authority with such confidence now seemed small and diminished in the federal courtroom. Your Honor, I want to apologize to the Chen family for my actions. I realize now that I was wrong to interfere with Jacob's medical care. And I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I let my desire to maintain community standards cloud my judgment. And I made serious mistakes. The apology, while necessary, felt inadequate given the scope of her actions and their impact on Jacob and his family. Judge Patricia Martinez, who had seen many discrimination cases during her career, was not impressed by Karen's belated contrition. Ms. Whitmore, your actions were not mistakes in judgment. They were deliberate choices to discriminate against a disabled child and his family. You used your position of authority to deny a minor access to medical care, and you did so with full awareness of the harm you were causing. The law exists to protect vulnerable individuals from exactly this kind of behavior. The judge's sentence was comprehensive and designed to send a clear message about the consequences of disability discrimination. Karen was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay $150,000 in fines and to complete 500 hours of community service working with disabled individuals. Additionally, Karen was permanently barred from serving in any HOA leadership position and was required to attend mandatory sensitivity training and anger management classes. The judge also issued a restraining order preventing her from having any contact with the Chen family. The civil lawsuit filed by the Chen family was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but sources close to the case suggested that the settlement was substantial. The money would be used to establish a foundation providing legal assistance to families facing housing discrimination based on disability. Karen's house in Meadowbrook Estates was eventually sold to cover her legal costs and the civil settlement. The new owners, a young couple with a disabled daughter, were welcomed warmly by the neighborhood under the reformed HOA leadership. The community had learned from its mistakes and was committed to being truly inclusive. Jacob Chen, meanwhile, had not only recovered from the trauma of Karen's harassment, but had found his voice as an advocate for disability rights. He began speaking at schools and community events about his experiences, helping to educate others about the challenges faced by disabled individuals and the importance of inclusive communities. What happened to me was wrong, but it also opened my eyes to how many people face discrimination because of disabilities. He said during a speech at a state disability rights conference, "We need to stand up for each other and make sure that everyone has the right to live in their community and get the medical care they need." Dr. Linda Chen continued her work as a pediatric neurologist, but she also became involved in disability rights advocacy. She worked with legislators to strengthen protections for disabled individuals and their families, and she served on the board of several organizations dedicated to fighting discrimination. David Chen, the governor's chief of staff, used the experience to push for comprehensive disability rights legislation at the state level. The Jacob Chen Act was signed into law 6 months after Karen's sentencing, providing stronger protections for disabled individuals and their families and establishing clearer penalties for discrimination. The case also led to reforms in HOA oversight and regulation. New state laws required HOA boards to receive training on disability rights and fair housing laws, and they established clear procedures for residents to report discrimination. The changes were designed to prevent future incidents, like the one that had torn apart Meadowbrook Estates. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly neighbor who had witnessed Karen's harassment, became an advocate for community healing and reconciliation. She organized neighborhood events designed to bring residents together and create a truly inclusive community spirit. Her efforts helped transform Meadowbrook Estates from a place of division into a model of neighborly cooperation. The case became a landmark in disability rights law, cited in legal briefs and academic papers as an example of how systematic discrimination could be successfully prosecuted. Law schools used it as a case study in civil rights enforcement, and it influenced federal policy on housing discrimination. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the message it sent to disabled individuals and their families across the country. The system had worked, justice had been served, and a community had learned to be better than it was before. 2 years after Karen's sentencing, Jacob Chen graduated from high school with honors and received a full scholarship to study pre-law at the state university. His acceptance speech at graduation was brief but powerful, focusing on the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. "I learned that sometimes the worst experiences can lead to the most important changes," he said. "What happened to my family was wrong, but it also led to laws that will protect other families from going through the same thing. That's what I call justice." The medical transport van that had once been the source of so much controversy now pulled up to the Chen house twice a week without incident. The neighbors waved as Jacob was loaded into the van for his therapy appointments, and some had even volunteered to help with his transportation when the regular service was unavailable. Meadowbrook Estates had become the kind of community it had always claimed to be a place where neighbors looked out for each other, where diversity was celebrated, and where everyone was welcome regardless of their differences or disabilities. The transformation was complete, and the community was stronger for having confronted its darkest impulses and chosen to do better. On a warm spring morning, exactly 3 years after Karen's first confrontation with the medical transport van, Jacob Chen sat in his wheelchair on the front porch of his family's home, reading a letter of acceptance to law school. He planned to specialize in disability rights law, inspired by his own experiences, and determined to help others facing similar challenges. The neighborhood around him was peaceful and welcoming, filled with the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting over garden fences. The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly maintained lawns, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak trees that lined the street. As Jacob folded the acceptance letter and placed it carefully in his lap, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The harassment and discrimination he had faced had been painful and frightening, but they had also revealed the strength of his community when it chose to do the right thing. The medical transport van rounded the corner, right on schedule for his therapy appointment. Jacob smiled as he watched it approach, no longer seeing it as a source of conflict, but as a symbol of his right to live freely and access the care he needed. The van pulled up to the curb, and Miguel stepped out with a warm greeting. "Ready for therapy, Jacob?" "Always ready," Jacob replied, his voice strong and confident. As he was loaded into the van, he waved to the neighbors who had gathered to wish him well. Mrs. Rodriguez blew him a kiss from her porch, and the Wu family's children called out cheerful goodbyes. The van pulled away from the curb smoothly, carrying Jacob toward his therapy appointment and his bright future. Behind them, Meadowbrook Estates settled into another peaceful day, its residents secure in the knowledge that they had built a community where everyone belonged and everyone was protected. The morning sun climbed higher into the clear blue sky, casting warm light across the neighborhood that had learned to embrace justice, compassion, and the true meaning of community. And in that light, the future looked bright indeed.